All right, so today I want to go over a little bit more of the specifics about my previous video, focusing on the differences between ontological nihilism, ontological restrictivism, and ontological permissivism. Just rehash a little bit what each of those means, and then go over my beliefs, which tend to lean more towards ontological permissivism. Why do I believe that? And what are the arguments for and against, and why do I find some of them more compelling than others? And so, again, the central question, I'll link to the other video here, but the central question is, if I set an apple in front of you, did I set any half apples in front of you? And even more specifically than that, if I set an apple in front of you, how many objects did I set in front of you? The nihilist position is you've set however many fundamental objects that are in that apple in front of me. The conservative position would be you set some finite number of ordinary objects in front of me, which would most likely include the apple itself, the seeds, the stem, the interior pieces, the atoms that compose it, and whatnot. And then the permissivist would say you set a lot of objects in front of me. And it just depends. It depends partly on whether there are those fundamental non-composite objects, but it also depends on everything else that you can build up from them. And so this is where the permissivist is inclined to say there are lots and lots of half apples, there are lots and lots of quarter apples, there are lots and lots of eighth apples, so on and so forth. And the nihilist view and the permissivist view are kind of neo-ontologies. They're newer, and that's not to say that they didn't appear at the same time. All of these can really be traced back to ancient Greece, even pre-Socratic, but they've really picked up in the academic, professional field more recently rather than, further back, especially not so much during the development of philosophical thought, anywhere from Plato through 1800s or so. And why is that? It's because there's a very compelling case for the restrictivist view. It's very intuitive and very friendly to everything that we believe in the first place. So why push against it? And it's only been recently that nihilism and permissivism have really been gaining some traction. Permissivism more so than nihilism, because nihilism makes it difficult to talk about objects in the first place. And we've decided that object names, at least, are very, very useful for what we do when we're formulating arguments for other things or when we're interacting with the world in general. And it's hard to get rid of that. It's very difficult to find a nihilist who actually practices what they believe, and will not talk about this apple here, and will not talk about myself as myself, only as a strange collection of fundamental objects of some sort that we don't really know of yet. And so restrictivism has this intuitive appeal, and it's hard to step away from that. One of the stronger defenders of the restrictivist view is Daniel Corman. He wrote a book about it, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. He was specifically defending restrictivism from a couple of argumentative attacks aimed from either the nihilist or the permissivist at debunking restrictivism. And in the process of reading his responses and analyzing his responses in that book, I was thoroughly unconvinced, and actually it convinced me more and more that the restrictivist has less standing than it appears, and that the nihilist and the permissivist might actually be onto something. And so what is that? Well, the fundamental argument for conservatism, for restrictivism rather, again, there's a lot of competing names that all mean more or less the same thing with slight differences. And so there's an appeal to intuition, to say we know what things are objects and we know what things are useful to us, and that reflects some aspect of reality. We don't have to know exactly what aspect of reality it specifically reflects, but we just have to know that it connects in some way. And there's a lot of good arguments for that. There's a lot of good arguments to say that our sense perceptions do reflect real things, things that exist in an objective world outside of our own perception. But the nihilist and the permissivist, one of their strongest arguments, in my opinion, is to say that the object definitions that the restrictivists give is arbitrary for any given object. And so there's a lot of different restrictivist positions. Some of them will allow for biological life as its own separate category of things. Others won't. Others, I mentioned in the past that even on this specific question of apples and half apples, the conservative has multiple options open to them. You can say I'm conservatively saying the apple exists, but no half apples exist. Or I can conservatively say that the apple exists and two half apples exist. But beyond that, it becomes less of a conservative point or less of a restrictivist point and more of a permissivist point. The argument is that object definitions are arbitrary. And this comes up in a lot of different examples. So we can kind of go through some of them here. And ideally, you can come up with a couple more on your own. So the first that I want to focus on is an island. So say you have an island, and it's a relatively small island, like very low out of the water. So at low tide, there actually is land above water. But then at high tide, it's fully submerged. Everything is underwater. And so if our definition of an island is a landmass that is above water, or surrounded by water in some way with a couple of extra restrictions, like can't be the size of the continent and a couple of other things, then what happens? Well, at low tide, we have an island. What happens at high tide? At high tide, the island is completely submerged. There's no longer an island there. There's nothing above water. And this is strange. This would be strange to talk about because that's going to reappear once low tide happens again. And it would be strange to say, okay, the island exists, at this point in the morning, and then it exists, then it disappears for a while, and then it comes back at this point in the evening, and then it disappears for a while again. That's just not how we think of islands. And so the other possibility is you'd say, well, the island is a landmass, and so that landmass has to be above water at some times. And you kind of loosen the definition a little bit. At that point, then we can say, okay, the island here is this landmass that is sometimes above water and sometimes below water, and that's totally fine. The landmass is going to exist there regardless. But when we're thinking of the island in the first place, what if we wanted to focus on just the land that is above water at any given time? So we could say that. We could say an island is land that is above water, that is surrounded by water, again, with some additional specifications. And then what do we get? We get this strange object where at the bottom, there's land that is underwater. So there's the ocean floor and different things, and that builds up and builds up. And then it immediately switches at the waterline to now being the island. And the island is something that cuts off at the waterline too. This is also, it feels a little bit strange, like it's not exactly what we want to refer to when we're talking about islands, but it could be. And so for me, each of those possibilities are things that we want to leave open. They're all different categorizations of the world as it is, and if we want to, we could choose to talk about any of those specific definitions, and one of them could be more useful to us in a situation than others. And so another example, say you have a lump of clay, and you're an artist, and you're starting to sculpt this lump of clay. And over time, a figure emerges. You're making like a human statue or something, something beautiful, how about? And at the end, you have a statue, and everything that was in the lump of clay to begin with still is in the statue. Let's suppose that. Now, it seems like you have two different things that you could talk about. You could talk about the lump of clay, and that is something that existed far before you ever existed. Maybe it wasn't altogether, but at some point, somebody pulled it out of the muck and then kind of aggregated it together. So you could talk about that, and that's going to exist far long after the statue exists too. Or you could talk about the statue itself. That was made by you, the artist, and it existed sometime relatively recently. It came into existence in a certain artistic process. And then it's going to decay at some point and eventually lose its form and then kind of go back to, well, we can just focus on the lump of clay now. And so there's a principle here attributed to Leibniz. Leibniz is the law that basically says if two things are the same, they will share all of the same properties. And so here we have two things that don't have the same properties. The lump of clay existed, far, far, long, long ago. And the statue existed relatively recently. Like, that's at least one difference. So it doesn't seem like these are the same objects. We can't go quite the other way and say that if two objects have all of the same properties, then they are the same object. That gets a little bit more messy because potentially you could have two objects that have all the same properties, but just can't distinguish them. And that's at least an open possibility in the philosophical field right now. So you have a statue, you have a lump of clay. They're different in some capacity. How do we account for that difference? And so the restrictivist is inclined to say that the statue is organized a certain way. There's an element of organization put into it, and that is different from the lump of clay. And so anything can kind of have this organizational element. But it would also allow the conservative to say, hey, if a clay asteroid hit the Earth, let's say, then if a piece of that broke off and just happened to be in the same atomic pattern, the same structural pattern as a statue, the statue that we made, let's suppose, is that now a statue, or is that just a lump of clay? And Corman at least has to go in and say, well, intentionality is also important. So we can separate objects by structure, we can separate objects by intentionality, and all these other like kind of more and more specific categories. And he's inclined to say that that is kind of carving reality at its joints, making these very fine categories for specific things that correspond to the important categorical differences that appear in objective reality around us. And again, the permissivist and the nihilist have this issue that, well, those are very, very arbitrary. And intentionality is, sure, that's something that you can choose to talk about, but it's not something that we choose to talk about in a lot of cases. And so there will be some cases that we do talk about it, like this statue and artistic kind of objects. But then there's others where it doesn't quite seem to work. Like there's a structure to a tree, even if maybe there isn't the intentionality behind it. And that's kind of maybe a separate point, but it's open to a little bit of this discussion. And so the specific argument of arbitrariness is basically that if the restrictivist wants to talk about these very intuitive objects, we have a lot of not intuitive objects that we've created. And so that's the things like statues. That's the things like when we look at a tree and we can say, oh, there's leaves on that tree. Well, the leaves are connected to the tree. They're not separate from it, but they are separated sometimes. So it's been useful for us to talk about the leaves and also talk about the tree. And perhaps it depends too on whether the tree needs leaves to exist or whether they don't. You could say, well, does an apple need half apples to exist, or doesn't it? But overall, the object definitions seem to be very, very arbitrary. And you can think too about your family. What is your family? When would your family stop existing? Maybe it would be each person in your family has to stop existing, or maybe all but one. And then your family stops existing. But your family is this strange object. It's not really connected physically. You're not physically connected to your mother, your father, or your brother or sister. But you have a relationship with them through physical means. And so that categorization is one of these kind of strange objects. And Corman brings up other examples too. You could have something like the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court made a decision in such and such a year, and then they also made a decision 20 years later. How about? And one specific justice on the Supreme Court made a decision such and such a year, and then that justice didn't make the decision 20 years later, let's suppose. And so if that's the case, then there seems to be a difference between justices and the actual Supreme Court. And again, Corman has kind of unique ways out of this that, again, feel to me a little bit too arbitrary. And so overall, the appeal for permissivism to me is that it allows you to have all of these object categories and be able to talk about them and be able to speak about them and argue with them. But it also gives you these other categories of things that we don't usually think about. So something like the combination of the apple and me and the microphone, suppose, like that's something, if we wanted to, we could talk about it as its own object. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. It would be a strange thing. And for the most part, the way that I see it is that we categorize objects based on kind of physical movement. So this apple is its own thing because it moves as its own thing, and I move differently than it, so I am different from it. And likewise, the leaf, it can move independently of the tree sometimes. And you might have a tree and a dog in your backyard, but they don't make an object because they don't move together. And kind of similarly too, when you're talking at the atomic level and smaller, you say, okay, well, these fundamental things, like they each move independently. So even the nihilist has some tendency toward this. But I don't think that that's particularly relevant. There isn't a reason to suppose that that actually determines what is real. And so kind of to explain that point a little bit more, we are biological things, biological creatures, let's say, and you can have a much more nuanced view on this, but for the very least, we'll say we're biological creatures. And that means that our perceptions of objects developed in some way. And to me, it seems like that is determining what is relevant to us. And the easiest thing to be relevant is what moves together. And it's going to be useful too. Like, we, as biological things, are going to improve at our ability to determine useful things to us. Now that we have cognition, hopefully we can do that a little bit more fine-tuned in our own lifetimes. It doesn't take generations and generations to kind of build up this improvement, but we can see what's useful to us. And so the moving together has a very obvious use. You want to avoid things that are moving together against you, and you want to move towards things that will benefit you. And that seems to me like something, a reasonable way of explaining why our intuitions are the way that they are. And it would also explain why, when an object is set in front of us, an intuitive object like this apple, that we are correct when we say it reflects something of reality. It's because we've learned to pick out those things. And it wouldn't be correct to say the opposite. We can't say, because we've learned to pick out things useful to us, I know that me and the apple and the microphone isn't an object. That's just something that's left kind of in this ambiguous space. And the point of the permissivist view is to consider, maybe that actually is something worth considering an object, or at least it could be considered an object, just as truthfully as the apple or the microphone or me individually could be considered an object. And that's important. That's a very important distinction. And actually, throughout the entire book, Corman recognizes that this is an important distinction, and he says that assortments are their own type of thing. Basically, you can have assortments of things, but they aren't actually an object. So they don't have this kind of nebulous object property that now I'm specifically attributing to the kind of unity of motion of this apple. Like, it can be spinning in my hands while I'm doing something else, while it's separated from the air that's around it and different things. But by assuming that you need to have this object property, and you could specify it differently, it doesn't have to be exactly what I'm saying it is. But if you have this object property and you say this is required for something to actually be an object, then you've already defined what an object is. And the issue in ontology specifically is that we're trying to figure out, from just existing in this world, what actually is a real designation. And so if you assume the object property, then you get everything that follows from the restrictivist view. But we can't assume that. And that's really the big draw here, the big draw towards the permissivist and the nihilist's view. So I'll leave you with something to think about. Just say, have you ever been able to consider yourself as something larger than just this body here? So have you ever identified with your group of friends, with your family, with your local community, with your larger community? Have you identified with everything that exists here on this world? Like, there's so many different ways that you can have an idea of what you are. And I think that's the easiest way to start getting a feel for the permissivist view. You say, well, what if I weren't trying to maximize my own actions in some way, but what if I were trying to say, well, me and my friends, like, let's figure out what's best for all of us collectively. What's best for me and my family? And how do I do that? That'll probably require some sacrifices on my part. And this actually blends, interestingly, into game theory. So game theory, I'll probably be making a whole separate video on this, but just to kind of give an overview here, it's basically a way of saying, if we have individual agents, which are basically just anything that can make decisions in an environment, what are they going to do? What are they going to do in an environment? And you give certain outcomes different values for any of this particular agents that are kind of playing this game. And then you can try to do some math and see like what actions should be taken. But it goes wrong if you were to say this individual agent isn't focused on maximizing its own value or its own situation, but it's focused on kind of improving a group situation. And again, this could just be as small as a couple of other people. It could be a family, or it could be something entirely larger, like a nation, a country. And when you have agents that are working towards something larger than themselves, they're going to make different decisions. And so you have to do the math completely differently. You have to say, okay, well, what's the overall benefits for some of those things? And so kind of the typical example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma, where basically you have two people who have been, arrested for some sort of crime, but the authorities can't seem to pin anything on either of them yet. And then they go in and talk to each individually and say, well, if you rat out the other person you are working with, then we'll be able to give you a reduced sentence. They go to the other person with the same offer, unbeknownst to you. And then the whole point of the game is, well, what should you do? And the typical answer that is visible is if each actor is acting independently and focused on maximizing their own goals, and the game is set up in such a way that you do receive a benefit for ratting on your partner in whatever way, then you should do that. That's the conclusion that you get to. But again, if you say, well, this individual person values something more than just themselves. You could say they value themselves some amount, but they also value kind of the overall group of the people they were working with at some rate as well. And that can change your entire answer. So you can get these situations where it's in an individual's best interest to work selfishly. But then if you focus on something larger than yourself, it's very easy for you to say, well, no, I don't want to act selfishly because I can see that there's a better option available to us if we all work together. And this is common. Like, this is how things have gotten so much better recently, and recently on a very long-term scale. So it's just something to think about. It really, your ontological views are going to impact things much beyond kind of this abstract philosophical world. And kind of my project going forward has been to see, okay, can I actually notice myself applying my belief to the situations that I exist in? And it also helps me figure out, okay, what are my values? Who am I trying to maximize kind of this game value for, in some sense? And obviously things are very complicated in the real world. But that's why we take some time to think about what we think about. So, see you next time.